Bonjour tout le monde. Good morning, everyone. It is a real pleasure for me to be here. In fact, this is the first time I have been in the Collège de France. And I would especially like to thank Jean-Jacques for organizing this homage to our late friend Yves Coppens, who had such an important impact on paleoanthropology in especially France, but in other places also. Almost to the hour, it is 1 year that I landed at Charles de Gaulle with my wife, Robin, who's here this morning. And we came last summer on the 15th of June to meet Yves. And the last time I had seen Yves was at a small conference at the Vatican. And we spoke briefly because obviously he was already ailing. And the topic of conversation was, what is going to happen on the 50th anniversary of the discovery of the Lucy skeleton? And what we spoke about, as I said briefly, was the fact that we wanted to organize something to celebrate that anniversary. 50 years, it's hard for us to believe that much time went by. But, and my travel schedule didn't allow me to come earlier, and we were to meet and discuss that. But unfortunately, as you know, it was during that period that he left us, and we did not have an opportunity to talk about how we would craft a colloquium or a symposium or a conference looking back on 50 years and also looking forward to the future of paleoanthropology, particularly in Ethiopia. So it was very unfortunate that we did not meet at that time, especially since he promised to take me out to some wonderful French food and wine, which I'm making up for right now. And I'm particularly appreciative that Jean-Jacques asked me to present a few remarks about my history with Yves, and indeed my history with many French scientists. As you see, I've entitled this The French Connection. You may have seen the movie. This is very different from the movie. And I was a student, like many of you were, with dreams and desires and wishes and hopes, and my fantasy was to go to Africa and to find fossils. And I was studying under the guidance of the late Professor Clark Howell at the University of Chicago, and somehow convinced him that I should go with him to Africa. So we traveled to the Omo together. I want to make sure another enigmatic. Voilà. So here is a satellite photo of the Horn of Africa, which is familiar to everybody, I think. And you can see very clearly that the Omo is situated just here north of Lake Turkana. It was Lake Rudolph in those days. And I could not have been more excited to be going there as a student. And was, of course, fantasizing about finding all of those wonderful human ancestor, or as we called them in those days, hominid fossils. And we have to be reminded that the Omo was originally explored by Camille, the late Camille Arenbourg, who was such an important mentor for Yves. And here they are together in 1968. And as you well know, Arenbourg passed away, and the directorship of the expedition was handed to Eve. And my professor, I'm not quite sure what he's reacting to here, but Clark Howell met Camille Arenbourg and was very well acquainted with Eve. And together, Eve and Clark Howell crafted an approach to study those sediments, continue to search for hominids, and to employ the new multi-interdisciplinary endeavor, which is called paleoanthropology. And there was an agreement as to who was going to work here and who was going to work there. There were two different research camps. There was a French camp and an American camp. And I was just beyond belief when Clark and I flew into the lower Omo River area. You see the Omo River, of course, heavily meandering, and the geological deposits just at the top there, which came to be known as the Shungura Formation. And I was especially pleased one evening to learn that we had received an invitation, or Clark had received an invitation from Yves and his wife, Françoise, to celebrate a dinner in the French camp. I had no idea what that really meant, but I was asked to go along with Clark, and when I arrived in, as we called it, the French camp, I was very warmly greeted by Yves and by everyone, and especially Françoise. And not only was I warmly welcomed, but the food and the wine were quite a significant improvement over what we were eating in the American camp, as you might imagine. And I was thinking, wow, imagine, you know, a Cabernet Sauvignon in the middle of the Great Rift Valley. This is quite different from what we were doing in our camp. And this invitation led to the beginning of long friendships and acquaintances with Yves, of course, and other French members of the team, such as the late Michel Boudin, Vera Eisenman, Claude Guimau, who was an award-winning artist who was organizing the expeditions for Yves, Raymond Bonfils, Jean-Jacques Hublin, Brigitte Senou, and many others. And as these friendships, and here you see Clark in the field, I'm talking about the water that's down in this riverbed and looking for it, and a very young me over here, Raymond Bonfils, and the late Jean de Heinzelin, who was an outstanding geologist who was from Belgium. And I found out that I really loved being in the field. It was something that resonated with me. But as the summer progressed, these friendships began to grow. And I began to get invitations to, you must come to Paris and come and visit me in my lab, and I will take you to dinner, and so on. And here I was, you know, 27 years old. I'd never been to Paris. And I was coming to collect some additional data for my very boring doctoral dissertation on chimpanzee teeth. And at that time, Yves was, of course, I don't know if he was director or sous-director of the Musée de l'Homme. Director. And he invited me to come to the Musée de l'Homme at Trocadero and to have a beautiful lunch. Food is another part of this presentation. A lovely lunch at Le Totem, a restaurant that's in that museum. And then he took me to see original specimens like Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal, La Chapelle-aux-Saints, and others. And we all know, all of us who are interested in human origins, that we could read about these things, but when you see them, it's really something very different. And he was so gracious in sharing these specimens with me. And I remember the sort of glint that he had in his eye, and you probably remember that too, because he was really enjoying showing these to me and how excited I was. And after that, we spent many evenings together with him, together at his home, where he lived at that time, which was a very interesting street, Rue de Pontachou, the Bridge of Cabbages, but, and enjoying again great French food and wine. I also visited with Raymond Bonnefille, one of the renowned palynologists in paleoanthropology, who wanted to show me her labo in Bellevue-Moudon. And she said she had somebody special she wanted me to meet, a man named Maurice Taïeb. And I asked her why, and she said that in 1968, when she was finishing her tour in Africa, her first tour, she met Maurice in Addis Ababa, and they went to the Afar together and visited some of the outcrops where there were incredibly interesting fossils eroding out of the deposits. And he was there, of course, Maurice. He was collecting data for a massive work on the geology of the Afar region, which is of very special importance to all geologists worldwide. And she said that they had found fossil sites that were really rich in fossils, with fairly complete fossils. And when I walked into the lab to meet Maurice, those of you who knew him, he was a very animated guy, and he loved to talk, and he was always surrounded in this gray smoke of Gauloise, smoking constantly. And he was so excited to talk about what he had found and to share it with somebody. And he pulled out these black and white photographs of pictures of teeth of elephants and rhinos and pigs and so on. And they were similar to the things that I had learned about in the Omo. And he thought, well, these specimens were, I think probably because he had shown some to Yves, were probably much older, that they were perhaps older than 3 million, more similar to things like those found in the Usno Formation or at Canapoi. And that was exciting to me. So after this exciting meeting, we went to the canteen and we had lunch, and Maurice was continually talking about all this. And he said, why would this be important? And I said, because at this time in the history of paleoanthropology, of the history of understanding our roots, the fossils older than 3 million years would all fit into the palm of your hand. We know very, very little. And if we could open this new vista into sediments that were older than 3 million, we might really develop an entirely new perspective on the earliest stages of human origins. And then we got back to the lab, and he sat down, and sort of that kind of sitting down like that with his Gauloise, and he said, would you like to come with me to the Afar? Well, it took me about 1/10 of a second to answer and say yes. So this was an enormous surprise to me, and another one of these very important French connections in my life. So in the spring of 1972, I took what was left of my very meager savings. I had just started teaching at Western Reserve in Cleveland, and we met in Addis Ababa to undertake a couple-week-long reconnaissance. And we had little financial backing. We didn't have tents. We sort of slept out on these little rami beds, as he called them, and ate spaghetti and tuna fish and just traveled around and found places that were unbelievably rich I've sometimes called some of, particularly the site of Hadar, where Lucy was found, sort of the El Dorado of paleoanthropology. And it was really, pretty much terra incognita. Very little was known about it. And we were making maps, we were making roads. And so here we are in 1972 at the site of Hadar. And down here you see the site of Omo. So we traveled northeast in the Great Rift Valley to, as we look at it now, it's so obvious that this is the largest expanse of the Great Rift Valley, because this part of Africa is, of course, moving away from the core of Africa. And the team consisted of 4 people. Eve came with us, of course. Maurice Taeb, the late John Kalb, who was a geologist, and a very young, long sideburned me. And it was one of the most exciting few weeks of my entire life to be there in the Afar, in a place that you knew that no other paleoanthropologist had ever walked or visited even. And at the end of that expedition, we sat down in Addis Ababa and crafted an agreement and named our group the International Afar Research Expedition. And it included the 4 of us with a number of other colleagues and a real focus on the particular site known as Hadar. We felt that was the most fossil-rich area, which you see here. And also it had beautiful exposures, as you see, and it was a fairly large area. It had a permanent source of water, which was the Awash River. And it had what was also very important for us. You see some of these white sediments in the background, which are volcanic ashes, which would allow us to really develop precise dating for the chronology at the site. And the first real field season transpired in 1973, when I received a rather small National Science Foundation grant. Maurice came with CNRS money. And I had worked in the Omo for, 3 summers and never found a hominid. So I was wondering, what kind of luck do I have? And the first discovery that was made, that was studied, here's the team in 1973, as you can see. Here is Maurice. Here is Pierre Planck, who was who was a cartographer. Maurice's assistant, Nicole Page. Tom Gray, a student of mine. Jean Dole, another student. Raymond Bonfils. John Kelp took this picture, so he's not in it. And we began to develop a relationship with the local Afar people who lived in this area. Maurice was very good at that, which was obviously incredibly important. So we looked and we looked and we looked, and of course the first discovery of a hominid in the entire Afar happened in October of 1973 and consists of this distal femur and proximal tibia, which has all of the anatomical hallmarks of one of the features of being human, upright walking. But of course, because it was a knee, it had no taxonomic identity. We didn't know what species it belonged to. I suspected it did belong in Australopithecus, and we will be hearing a lot about Australopithecus today from many quarters. And the following season, I was able to raise a little more money to support the expedition, and the team grew, as you can see. There are a number of individuals now. Claude Guimau has joined the group, and very importantly, Hélène Roche, an archaeologist of some note, who later went on to make the first discovery of Oldowan stone tools at Hadar, just adjacent in an area known as Gona, and a wonderful, wonderful archaeologist. And a number of people also visited us during the time, which I won't mention. And I want to point out one of our great fossil finders, sorry. And so it was a wonderful, more people began to work with us in the local area. And in 1974, we began to find lots of teeth and jaws. Alamayo Asfau was a really incredible fossil finder. We found complete upper jaws, we found mandibles, we found parts of the postcranial bones, and it was also the year that I invited, well, Maurice actually came up with this idea, we invite Richard Leakey, the late Richard Leakey, to come and visit us. And he came with his mother, Mary, and his wife, Meve, and they were overwhelmed at the site. And the day after they left us, I went out and found Lucy. He missed it by one day. So this partial skeleton, which has become popularly known as Lucy and almost virtually iconic in terms of paleoanthropology, really focused attention on the Afar. Everybody sort of woke up and said, we've got to go there. We have to have more expeditions in the area. And so this specimen was named by someone on the expedition after a Beatles song, as most of you know, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. It's interesting, today there is a NASA space mission going to study asteroids near the planet Jupiter, which were remnants of the origin of our solar system. And that NASA project is called the Lucy expedition, to find out more about how the solar system was created. And there are diamonds on board that craft for lenses, so Lucy is back in the sky with diamonds. At that time, we felt also that she really deserved an Ethiopian name. After all, this was the country in which she lived. And someone from the Ministry of Culture visiting suggested the name Dinkinesh, which means you are wonderful. And the Afar people were very excited by this. Imagine, I mean, these are nomadic Muslim people who have very little room for the perspective of evolution. But they call her Hilomali, which means also you are wonderful, or she is special. And what is so heartwarming is that the Afar think that Lucy was an Afar, and therefore all human beings are descended from their tribe. And I know that Eve regretted not being there at the time of discovery. He was always complaining about administration. You have no administration in Paris, do you? And he couldn't get out of this mound of administration. But when he found out about the discovery, he immediately came with a film crew to memorialize this find. And in this picture, you see Maurice and me the day before his arrival, beginning to assemble this and lay it out onto a black background. And now it was my turn to watch him be the excited one. And I will never forget, always remember that captivating smile we were just looking at of Eve up there, as he stood next to the table and was grinning from ear to ear with excitement and reward. Sort of like a proud uncle. And in 1975, the year after, our team was back, and a medical doctor on the team found the first remains at this site, which is known as Afar Locality 333, or the first family. A couple of hundred bone fragments, including partial skulls of adult and a child skull, mandibles, all sorts of, probably somewhere between 15 to 18 individuals, from infants to adults. sort of a catastrophic assemblage. That's why it was called the first family. The storehouse of fossils, which ultimately we named in 1978, Australopithecus afarensis, to honor the Afar people in the Afar region, is growing all the time. And, you know, when we think about where is this field going? Well, there are a number of people, two in particular in the audience, Johannes Haile Selassie, who is now my boss, and Zeres and Ayalem Seged, who are, along with others, exploring areas. You see there's, down here is Hadar, and these sites are all around here, north and east. And these sites are, and you will hear about them later, I'm sure, from both of these gentlemen, going to add more and more information to the world in which Australopithecus afarensis lived. And as the samples grew, and it is probably the single best known fossil species of that time, and is referred to as a very important comparative collection that people go to compare their discoveries. And as that grew and the analysis proceeded, what happened was not unusual. There were many things that Eve and I disagreed on, friendly disagreements. The geometry of the family tree, he had his own sort of version. The number of species at Hadar, what their locomotion was like, what their ancestor-descendant relationships were with other fossils. And, you know, it's not unusual that there's some disagreement in this field of paleoanthropology. But it was always interesting to sit and to disagree about these various things. But what we had in common, Eve and me, was the passion and the excitement of discovery. The passion and excitement about learning more about our past, our beginnings, and that very simple question that we all ask ourselves, that's universal with all cultures and societies: where did we come from? And to share that information, the ever-changing landscape of this fossil's important, that fossil's important, now this one isn't, now that one isn't, and the new technology, imaging, everything from imaging to DNA analysis. And Eve really completely understood the importance of bringing that information to a broader audience. He knew it was his responsibility to be an ambassador of science. And this, I think, is what he should be most remembered for, helping answer that age-old question, where did we come from? Thank you.